The first thing you should know about me is that I've always prided myself on being a rational guy. I'm not the type to jump to conclusions or let emotions cloud my judgment. As an architect, I approach life like I approach my projects, with a solid foundation, careful planning, and a focus on the big picture. That's probably why, for years, I thought my life with Clara was unshakable. We've been married for 7 years, and by most accounts, we've had a good run. Clara is the type of woman who commands attention without even trying. She's confident, ambitious, and the kind of person who can light up a room just by walking into it. I used to joke that she could convince anyone to do anything, and honestly, I wasn't exaggerating. She had that rare combination of charm and determination that made people gravitate toward her. When we first met, I was captivated. We met at a friend's housewarming party, a chaotic mix of loud music and mismatched furniture. I was nursing a beer in the corner, trying to avoid the crowd, when she walked up to me. She was wearing this bright red dress and a smile that could disarm anyone. "You look like you're building an escape plan," she said, tilting her head and smirking. I laughed, nervously probably, and we ended up talking for the rest of the night. Things moved quickly after that. Clara had a way of making the ordinary feel extraordinary. We were a team, and for a long time, it felt like we were unstoppable. We renovated our house together, a 2-story fixer-upper that became our shared passion project. Every room held a memory. Late nights painting walls, laughing over mismeasured tiles, and celebrating when we finally got the kitchen just right. Our friends used to call us the golden couple. We had the house, the careers, and the kind of relationship that looked flawless from the outside. I thought it was flawless too, for the most part. But over the past year, something shifted. It started with little things. Clara began working late more often, claiming her projects were ramping up. That wasn't unusual for her. She thrived on challenges and loved her job. At first, I didn't think much of it. But then there were the moments I couldn't ignore. She started putting more effort into her appearance before heading to the office. Clara had always been stylish, but suddenly it felt different. She'd spend extra time in front of the mirror, trying on outfits she used to save for special occasions, adding subtle but striking touches to her makeup. "You're looking fancy today," I teased one morning as she slipped on a fitted blazer I didn't remember seeing before. She laughed it off. "Important client meeting," she said, grabbing her bag and kissing me quickly on the cheek. Then there was her phone. Clara had always been glued to it, scrolling through social media or texting her friends. But now, she seemed more guarded. If I walked into the room, she'd lock the screen or flip it over. When I asked her about it once, she brushed it off, saying, "Work stuff, boring emails, you wouldn't care." I wanted to believe her. I told myself that she was just under a lot of pressure at work, that this was all part of her climbing the corporate ladder. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The real kicker was how distant she became. In public, she was still the same Clara, charming, witty, and effortlessly engaging. She'd laugh at my jokes, hold my hand, and play the part of the perfect wife. But when we were alone, it was like being in a room with a stranger. Conversations felt forced, her laughter felt hollow, and intimacy was rare, if not non-existent. I started questioning myself. Was I imagining things? Was I being too sensitive? Relationships go through phases, right? Maybe this was just one of those rough patches everyone talks about. So I brushed it off. I told myself that I trusted Clara, that our relationship was strong enough to weather whatever was happening. After all, we had 7 years of history, of shared dreams and built memories. How could I let a few late nights and odd moments undermine all of that? But even as I tried to convince myself, that nagging feeling in the back of my mind refused to go away. Looking back now, I realize it was the cracks in the foundation. Cracks I didn't want to see. Cracks I didn't want to admit were growing. At the time, I told myself everything was fine. I had no idea how wrong I was. Victor. His name crept into my life the way a faint crack can grow into a gaping chasm. Slowly, at first, almost imperceptibly. Clara mentioned him casually one evening during one of her animated rants about work. She'd just gotten home late again, kicked off her heels, and poured herself a glass of wine before launching into her usual complaints about office politics. "There's this new guy," she began, her tone annoyed but tinged with something I couldn't quite place. "Victor, he's one of those annoyingly confident types, you know? Thinks he's God's gift to marketing just because he landed a big account last month." I chuckled, not thinking much of it. "Sounds like a pain," I said, flipping through the channels on TV. She laughed, rolling her eyes. "You have no idea." And that was it. Just another character in the drama of Clara's work life. Or so I thought. But then his name started coming up more often. "Victor thinks we should revamp our whole pitch strategy," she said one night, scrolling through her phone as we ate dinner. "It's ambitious, but I have to admit, he's got a point." A week later, "Victor's taking the lead on the new account. He's persistent, I'll give him that." And again, "Victor had everyone laughing in the meeting today. He's got this way of, I don't know, breaking the tension." At first, I chalked it up to work chatter. Clara was a talker after all, and her stories about coworkers had always been a part of our routine. But something about the way she said his name started to bother me. It wasn't what she said. It was how she said it. There was a subtle shift in her tone, a brightness that hadn't been there before. I tried not to overthink it. People have work friends, and I trusted Clara, but the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away, especially when Victor started showing up in other places, like her social media. Clara was never one to post much about her job. She kept her personal life and professional life separate, or at least she used to. But suddenly, there he was, popping up in group photos from office events. There was one picture in particular that made my stomach turn. It was from an after-work happy hour, a blurry shot of Clara and a group of coworkers raising their glasses. Victor was standing next to her, his arm slung casually around her shoulders, both of them grinning like they'd known each other for years. "Who took this one?" I asked, trying to sound neutral as I showed her the picture. "Oh, that," she said, barely glancing at it. "Just one of the interns. It was a fun night. Victor insisted we all unwind after a stressful week." She brushed it off so easily, like it was nothing. But I couldn't shake the image from my mind. Then came the wardrobe changes. Clara had always dressed well for work, professional but stylish, nothing over the top. But now she seemed to be putting in extra effort. Tight skirts, fitted blouses, bold lipstick. One morning, I watched as she tried on 3 different outfits before settling on one, something I'd never seen her do before. "You're looking sharp today," I teased, leaning against the doorframe. She smiled at me through the mirror. "You know how it is. Gotta look the part if you want to get ahead." "Since when do you care so much about appearances?" I asked, half joking. She shrugged, still fussing with her hair. "It's just a competitive environment, James. People notice these things." It sounded reasonable enough, but it didn't sit right with me. Clara wasn't one to care about impressing others, at least not before. Her growing enthusiasm for office events was another red flag. Clara used to groan at the thought of team-building retreats and after-hours networking events. Now she seemed to be looking forward to them. "We're having another happy hour this Friday," she said one evening, scrolling through her calendar. "Another one?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah, it's good for morale," she replied quickly, not meeting my eyes. "For morale." Right. I wanted to trust her. I wanted to believe that this was just a phase, that her job was demanding more from her and she was rising to the occasion. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that Victor was becoming more than just a coworker to her. I told myself I was being paranoid. Clara loved me. We had a good marriage, didn't we? But the doubt lingered, growing with each passing day. Looking back, I realized that was the moment everything began to change. I just didn't know it yet. The red flags weren't glaring at first. They were subtle, like whispers in the background of a noisy room. At least that's how it started. But as time went on, those whispers became impossible to ignore. Clara began staying late at the office more often. At first, I didn't think much of it. Her job had always been demanding, and she had a habit of throwing herself into big projects. But this felt different. The late nights became more frequent, and her reasons for staying seemed vague, almost rehearsed. "Another late meeting?" I asked one evening as she grabbed her coat. She gave me a quick smile. "Yeah, tight deadlines. You know how it is." I nodded, trying to push down the unease creeping up my spine. But that unease only grew. One night, I decided to call her office phone, just to say hi and maybe hear her voice. It rang and rang before going to voicemail. That wasn't unusual. She could have been in a meeting. But then, minutes later, I saw her online on social media. She'd posted a picture, a group selfie from what looked like a bar. Clara was in the center, holding up a glass of wine, and right beside her, grinning like he owned the world, was Victor. When she got home that night, I tried to bring it up casually. "Busy night?" I asked as she set her purse down. "Exhausting," she sighed, kicking off her heels. I paused, studying her face. "I saw that photo you posted. Looked like a fun meeting." She froze for a fraction of a second before recovering with a laugh. "Oh, that." "Yeah, we decided to grab drinks after. It was Victor's idea. He's big on team bonding." "Team bonding," I repeated, my tone flat. She waved it off. "It's nothing, just work stuff." Work stuff. That became her default answer for everything. Our arguments became more frequent after that. It was like every question I asked about her late nights or Victor's increasing presence in her life was met with defensiveness. "Why are you always on my case, James?" she snapped one night after I asked why she was heading to yet another after-hours event. "I'm not on your case," I replied, trying to stay calm. "I just feel like you've been distant lately." "Distant?" she scoffed, throwing her hands up. "I'm working hard, James. I'm trying to succeed at my job, and all you can do is accuse me of being distant? Maybe if you weren't so controlling, you'd see that?" Controlling. That word hit me harder than I expected. Was I being controlling? Was I overthinking everything? For a while, I started to question myself. But then, there were the hints from our friends. Subtle comments, offhand remarks that didn't seem like much at the time but started to paint a picture when put together. "Clara and Victor seem to be really hitting it off at work," one friend mentioned during a dinner party. "Yeah, they're like the dream team," another added with a laugh. I forced a smile, but inside, my stomach churned. Was I the only one seeing this for what it was? The moment everything changed was when I saw the text. It was a Sunday morning, and Clara had left her phone on the counter while she stepped into the shower. Normally, I wouldn't touch her phone. It wasn't my business. But the screen lit up with a notification, and Victor's name was right there. The message read, "Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again." I stared at it, my heart pounding in my chest. My first instinct was to believe the worst, but I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. When Clara came back into the room, I held up her phone. "Victor texted you," I said, my voice carefully neutral. Her eyes flicked to the screen, and I saw the flash of panic before she masked it with a laugh. "Oh, that? He's just joking. We all went out for drinks last night. He probably means the group had a good time." "Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again," I repeated, emphasizing every word. "That doesn't sound like a group text, Clara." She sighed, rolling her eyes. "James, you're overreacting. Victor is just like that. He's overly friendly. It's harmless." Harmless. That word echoed in my head as I set her phone down and walked away, my trust in her shattered. For the first time, I felt like I was truly losing her. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I could ever get her back. That night started like so many others had lately, with Clara texting me to say she'd be working late again. Big presentation tomorrow, she wrote. Don't wait up. I'll grab something to eat on the way home. I stared at the message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the reply button. Every instinct in me screamed that something wasn't right. The text was too polished, too deliberate. It felt rehearsed, like she'd been using this excuse for so long that it had become second nature. For months, I'd been telling myself I trusted her, but that trust had been eroded piece by piece. The unanswered calls, the guarded phone, the late nights that never seemed to end. And then there was Victor, always lingering at the edges of her stories, her posts, her life. Tonight, I couldn't ignore the gnawing doubt any longer. I needed to know. I grabbed my car keys, telling myself it was just to ease my mind, to prove to myself that I was being paranoid. I'd drive to her office, see her working late like she said, and then head home feeling like a fool for doubting her. The drive felt longer than it should have, the quiet hum of the engine doing nothing to calm my nerves. When I pulled up to the office building, it was eerily still. Most of the lights were off, save for a few dimly lit hallways. Clara's office, however, glowed brightly on the third floor. I parked and made my way inside, my footsteps echoing in the empty lobby. The elevator ride felt like an eternity, the faint hum of the machinery matching the pounding of my heart. When the doors slid open, I stepped into the hallway, the sound of muffled voices drawing me toward her office. At first, I thought I was imagining it, the low hum of laughter, the faint sound of hushed words. But as I got closer, it became unmistakable. I stopped just outside her office, my hand resting on the edge of the partially open door. I could hear them clearly now, Victor's voice, deep and smooth, followed by Clara's unmistakable laugh. The kind of laugh she used to reserve for me. My stomach tightened as I peered through the crack in the door. There she was, sitting on her desk, her legs crossed and her head tilted back slightly as Victor leaned in close. His hand rested on her thigh, slowly sliding upward beneath her skirt. Clara's hands were tangled in his hair, her lips pressed against his in a kiss that was anything but innocent. Time seemed to freeze. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was stare, the scene in front of me shattering any lingering hope I'd had that this was all in my head. I don't know how long I stood there, rooted to the spot, my heart pounding in my chest. It could have been seconds, or it could have been minutes. All I knew was that I couldn't stay silent. "Clara," I said, my voice low but cutting through the room like a blade. The sound of my voice hit them like a thunderclap. Victor jerked away, his face pale as he turned to look at me. Clara froze, her eyes wide with shock and something that might have been fear. "James," she stammered, sliding off the desk and smoothing her skirt as though that would somehow erase what I'd just seen. "What are you doing here?" "What am I doing here?" I repeated, my voice rising. "That's the question you're asking me right now? What the hell are you doing, Clara?" Victor, ever the smooth talker, tried to interject. "Look, man, this isn't what it looks like." I didn't let him finish. The rage I'd been holding back for months boiled over, and before I knew what I was doing, I'd crossed the room and grabbed him by the collar. "Not what it looks like?" I spat, my face inches from his. "You have your hands under my wife's skirt, and you're going to tell me it's not what it looks like?" Victor's eyes darted to Clara, silently pleading for help, but she stood frozen, her face pale and her hands trembling. "James, please," she said weakly, stepping toward me. "Let's just talk about this." "Talk?" I barked, shoving Victor back into the wall. "You want to talk now? After this?" Victor tried to free himself from my grip, but I wasn't letting go. My hands shook with anger, and for a moment, I didn't trust myself to speak. Finally, I let go of him, shoving him away with enough force to make him stumble. "Get out," I growled. "Before I do something we'll all regret." Victor didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed his jacket and bolted, leaving Clara and me alone in the office. She looked at me, tears streaming down her face, but I didn't feel pity. All I felt was the crushing weight of betrayal. "James," she said softly, her voice breaking. "I can explain." "Save it," I said, my voice cold and hollow. "I've heard enough." I turned and walked out, not looking back. My mind was spinning, my chest tight with a mix of anger and heartbreak. The woman I thought I knew, the life I thought we'd built together, it all felt like a lie. As I drove away, the only thing I knew for certain was that nothing would ever be the same again. The moment I stepped into Clara's office, the tension in the air became almost unbearable. It was as though time slowed down, and every detail etched itself into my mind. The startled look on Clara's face, Victor's awkward attempt to adjust his posture as if that would somehow make the situation less damning, and the suffocating silence that fell over the room. "What the hell is this?" I said, my voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. Victor was the first to react, his face turning a sickly shade of pale as he raised his hands in what I assume he thought was a gesture of surrender. "Hey man, this isn't what it looks like." "Don't," I snapped, taking a step toward him. "Don't you dare insult my intelligence by trying to spin this." Clara stammered, her face a mixture of shock and guilt. "James, please. I can explain." "Explain?" I cut her off, my voice rising. "Explain what, Clara? That I just caught you with this piece of garbage? That you've been lying to me for months?" Victor took a cautious step back, his hands still raised. "Look, man, let's all just calm down, okay? It's not what you think." I turned my full attention to him, my vision narrowing. "Oh, really?" "Because it looks like you had your hands all over my wife. So please, enlighten me. What am I missing?" Victor opened his mouth, probably to spout some excuse, but I didn't let him. The anger that had been simmering for weeks boiled over, and before I knew it, I had crossed the room and grabbed him by the arm. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I growled, my grip tightening. "James, stop," Clara cried, stepping forward, but I barely heard her. Victor struggled against my grip, his confident demeanor crumbling into panic. Hey, easy man, let's talk about this." The sound of his arm cracking was loud and sickening, and his scream pierced the air like a siren. He crumpled to the floor, clutching his arm and gasping in pain. "James!" Clara's voice was sharp, but I couldn't bring myself to look at her. I stood over Victor, my fists clenched, every muscle in my body trembling with rage. "You thought you could waltz into my life, into my marriage, and get away with it?" I spat. "Do you even understand what you've destroyed?" Victor didn't answer. He was too busy writhing on the floor, his face twisted in agony. "James, please," Clara said again, her voice trembling. She reached out to touch my arm, but I pulled away as though her touch burned. "Don't," I said, turning to face her. "Don't you dare try to make this about me. You did this, Clara. You betrayed me. You brought him into our lives, into our marriage." Her eyes filled with tears, spilling down her cheeks as she shook her head. "It wasn't like that," she whispered. "I didn't mean for this to happen." "Didn't mean for it to happen," I repeated, my voice rising. "So what was it, Clara? A mistake? A slip? How long has this been going on?" She hesitated, and that hesitation was all the answer I needed. "God," I said, running a hand through my hair as the weight of it all hit me. "I trusted you, Clara. I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me?" "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry, James. Please, let's talk about this. We can fix it." "Fix it?" I laughed bitterly. "You think we can fix this? After everything? Do you even realize what you've done to me? To us?" She stepped closer, desperation written all over her face. "I made a mistake. I'll do whatever it takes to make it right. Please, James, don't throw us away." I stared at her, at the woman I thought I knew. and felt nothing but a hollow ache where my love for her used to be. "There's nothing left to throw away," I said quietly. With that, I turned and walked out of the office, ignoring Clara's cries and Victor's groans of pain. My mind was a whirlwind of anger, heartbreak, and disbelief as I made my way to my car. As I drove away, the weight of the betrayal settled over me like a suffocating blanket. The woman I had loved, the life we had built together, it was all gone, and there was no going back. When I walked out of Clara's office that night, I thought I could leave the weight of it behind. I thought the raw pain, the anger, and the disbelief would stay confined to that room. But it didn't. It followed me, shadowing my every step, creeping into every corner of my mind. I couldn't go back to the house, not after what I'd just witnessed. The idea of sleeping in the same bed where we had shared laughter and dreams now felt unbearable. Instead, I drove to Eric's place. He's been my best friend since college, the kind of guy who would drop everything for me, no questions asked. When I knocked on his door, it was late, but Eric answered within seconds, his face etched with concern. "James, what's going on, man?" I didn't even know where to start. I felt like I was drowning, my thoughts tangled in a mess of rage and heartbreak. All I managed to say was, "I need a place to crash." "Of course," he said, stepping aside to let me in. "You don't even have to explain. Just sit down and we'll figure it out." I dropped onto his couch, and for the first time that night, the adrenaline started to wear off. My hands were still shaking, and my chest felt tight. Eric handed me a glass of water and waited patiently, letting the silence fill the space until I was ready to talk. When I finally told him everything, Clara, Victor, the confrontation, his jaw clenched, and I could see the anger bubbling beneath his calm exterior. "James," he said carefully, "I don't even know what to say. I can't imagine what you're going through." "I don't know what to do, Eric," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I feel like everything I thought I knew about my life just got ripped away." He nodded, leaning forward. "First thing, don't make any big decisions right now. You're hurt and you're angry, and that's natural, but you need time to process this. Focus on yourself for a while. Let the dust settle before you figure out your next move." His advice made sense, but it didn't make the pain any easier to bear. The next few days were a blur. I stayed at Eric's, barely eating, barely sleeping, just existing in a haze of emotions I couldn't seem to untangle. Meanwhile, Clara's attempts to reach me started almost immediately. She left voicemails, tearful, frantic messages begging me to call her back. "James, I'm so sorry. Please, can we just talk? It was a mistake, a horrible mistake. I love you and I'll do whatever it takes to fix this." She sent texts, paragraphs of apologies and promises to change. "I'll quit my job if that's what it takes. I'll go to counseling. Just please don't give up on us." I read them all, but I didn't respond. What was there to say? Nothing she could write or say would erase the image of her with Victor, the sound of her laugh as he touched her. Then came the news about Victor. Eric was the one who told me. "Guess who just filed a complaint with Clara's HR department?" he said one evening, his voice tinged with disbelief. "What are you talking about?" I asked, frowning. "Victor," he said, shaking his head. "He's claiming you assaulted him and that Clara was complicit in letting it escalate." For a moment, all I could do was stare at him. "He's trying to spin this like it's my fault?" "Yeah," Eric said. "But here's the kicker. Apparently other employees are coming forward. People are saying Victor has a history of crossing boundaries, hitting on coworkers, making people uncomfortable. He's got a reputation, James, and HR isn't buying his story." It was some small, cold comfort to know that Victor's slimy behavior was finally catching up to him. Within a week, word got out that he'd been fired. Clara, meanwhile, wasn't spared. Though she wasn't officially reprimanded, her involvement with Victor had tarnished her reputation at work. People whispered behind her back, questioning her judgment, her integrity. Through it all, Clara kept trying to reach me, but her apologies rang hollow. Each message she left felt like an echo of a life we'd lost, a life I wasn't sure I wanted to reclaim. Eric was right. I needed time. Time to figure out who I was without Clara, without the life we'd built together. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. Things would never be the same again. Word spreads faster than I expected. The fallout from Clara's betrayal wasn't just confined to our lives. It spilled into the lives of our families and friends, dragging everyone into the mess. Suddenly, our private disaster became a public spectacle, with people picking sides like it was some kind of competition. The first to weigh in was my sister, Lily. She's always been fiercely protective of me, even when I didn't ask for it. When I called her to explain what happened, she went quiet for a moment, and then, in true Lily fashion, erupted. "She what?" she shouted over the phone. "That manipulative, selfish. James, I can't believe this. How could she do this to you?" "It happened," I said quietly, the weight of the situation sinking deeper with every word. "I'm coming over," she said, and before I could protest, she hung up. An hour later, Lily was in Eric's apartment, pacing back and forth with a level of fury that almost rivaled my own. "I never liked that Victor guy," she said, crossing her arms. "The way she talked about him. I should have seen this coming." "This isn't about Victor," I said, slumping into the couch. "It's about Clara. She made her choices." Lily sat down beside me, her anger softening into something more protective. "Listen, James. Don't let anyone make you feel like this is your fault. She broke your trust. She's the one who threw everything away, not you." Her support was a lifeline I hadn't realized I needed. Then came the call from Clara's mother, Margaret. "James," she began, her voice gentle but tinged with desperation. "I heard what happened. Clara told me everything." "Did she?" I asked, the bitterness in my voice surprising even me. "She's devastated," Margaret said quickly. "She knows she made a terrible mistake, and she's willing to do whatever it takes to fix it. Please, James, don't throw your marriage away over this. Everyone makes mistakes." "Everyone makes mistakes," I repeated, my grip tightening on the phone. "This wasn't a mistake, Margaret. This was a series of choices. She chose to lie. She chose to betray me. She chose him." Margaret sighed heavily. "She's my daughter, James. I have to believe she can come back from this. That you two can come back from this." "I appreciate you calling," I said curtly, ending the conversation before my anger could spill out further. The hardest part was navigating our mutual friends. It was clear that most of them were caught in the middle, unsure of how to handle the situation. At a small gathering a week later, one I attended reluctantly, two of our closest friends, Rachel and Ben, pulled me aside. "Look," Rachel started, "we're not taking sides, okay? But we think you might have overreacted a little with Victor." "Overreacted?" I said, raising an eyebrow. Ben jumped in, his tone cautious. "We're not defending what Clara did, but breaking the guy's arm? That's a lot, James." I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. "He had his hands under my wife's skirt. What would you have done?" Rachel glanced away, uncomfortable. "We're just saying, violence complicates things. That's all." Not everyone was so diplomatic. Another friend, Marcus, who had been in my corner since college, made his stance clear over a beer one night. "She did you dirty, man," he said, shaking his head. "And don't let anyone make you feel bad for what you did to that guy. He deserved worse." "Not everyone sees it that way," I said, thinking of Rachel and Ben. Marcus snorted. "Then they don't understand. A man who disrespects another man's marriage like that deserves whatever comes his way. And Clara, she made her bed." His words echoed the anger I felt, but didn't make it any easier to process. The division among friends and family added another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. Every interaction felt like navigating a minefield, with opinions flying from every direction. Some defended Clara, calling for forgiveness and second chances. Others stood firmly in my corner, condemning her betrayal and urging me to move on. The thing is, none of them had to live with the fallout. None of them had to sit with the crushing weight of betrayal, the sleepless nights, the gnawing questions of what if and why. This wasn't just a story to take sides on. It was my life. And no one, not even those closest to me, could truly understand what that felt like. The decision to file for divorce wasn't made lightly, but it was inevitable. After everything that had happened, the lies, the betrayal, and the confrontation, I couldn't see a path forward for Clara and me. Trust, once shattered, isn't something you can just glue back together. I sat in the lawyer's office, feeling a strange mix of anger, sadness, and resignation as I explained the situation. The lawyer, a calm and professional woman named Marissa, listened intently, her pen moving quickly across her notepad. "You're well within your rights to file for divorce, James," she said when I finished recounting the events. "The betrayal alone is grounds enough, but the physical confrontation may complicate things." I nodded, though her words stung. Complicate things. That's all my life seemed to be now, one complication after another. "What's the next step?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside me. Marissa laid out the process: filing the papers, serving Clara, and beginning the division of assets. It all sounded so clinical, so cold, for something that had once been so full of love and warmth. When Clara was served with the papers, she called me almost immediately. I let it go to voicemail, and when I finally listened to the message, her voice was shaking. "James, I just got the papers. Is this really what you want? I know I hurt you, and I know I messed up, but divorce? Please, can't we talk about this? We've been through so much together. Don't throw it all away." Her words hung in the air long after the message ended. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of doubt. Was I throwing it all away? Or had she already done that the moment she chose Victor over me? The first meeting with Clara after filing was tense, to say the least. We sat across from each other at Marissa's office, the table between us feeling more like a canyon. "James," Clara said softly, her voice cracking, "do you really want this? To end us?" I met her gaze, searching for some trace of the woman I had once loved. "Clara, there's no us anymore. You made sure of that." She blinked rapidly, tears pooling in her eyes. "I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but I still love you. Doesn't that mean anything?" "It means you should have thought about that before you betrayed me," I said, my tone colder than I intended. "Love isn't enough, Clara. Not after what you did." Her tears spilled over, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sympathy. Not this time. As the divorce proceedings moved forward, I found myself reflecting on our relationship more than I expected. Clara's betrayal was the final blow, but it wasn't the only crack in our foundation. I started to think about the little ways we had drifted apart over the years. The routines that had replaced the passion, the silence that had crept into our conversations. Looking back, I could see how I had grown complacent. I took for granted that Clara would always be there, that her energy and spark would fill the gaps I didn't know how to address. I focused on my work, my responsibilities, and assumed that was enough. But relationships don't thrive on assumptions. They require effort, attention, and communication, all things I hadn't given enough of. That didn't excuse what Clara did. Her choices were hers alone, and they destroyed what we had. But as I sat alone at night, thinking about the life we had built and lost, I couldn't help but wonder if things could have been different. If I had noticed the distance earlier. If I had fought harder to close the gap between us. Clara, for her part, continued to plead for reconciliation. She left messages filled with promises to change, to make things right. "I'll go to therapy," she said in one voicemail. "We can go to counseling together. Whatever it takes, James. Just don't give up on us." But every time I heard her voice, All I could picture was her in that office with Victor's hands on her. There was no going back. The final hearing was surreal. Sitting in that courtroom, signing the papers that would officially end our marriage, felt like closing the door on a part of my life I had never expected to lose. When it was over, Clara approached me outside the courthouse. "James," she said softly, her eyes red and swollen. "I'm sorry for everything. I'll regret what I did for the rest of my life." I nodded, my emotions a tangled mess. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Clara. But it's not with me." As I walked away, I felt an odd sense of relief. The marriage was over, but so was the pain of trying to hold on to something that had already slipped through my fingers. It was time to start over, to rebuild, to figure out who I was without her. The fallout wasn't just legal, it was emotional too. But for the first time in months, I felt like I could finally begin to move forward. The day the divorce was finalized felt strangely anticlimactic. I had imagined some profound sense of closure, a heavy door slamming shut on the most painful chapter of my life. Instead, it felt more like a quiet sigh, a soft, barely audible release of something I'd been holding on to for too long. For the first time in months, I was no longer tethered to Clara or the wreckage of our marriage. It was over, officially and irrevocably, and all that was left to do was figure out what came next. The first thing I did was reclaim my space. I moved out of Eric's place and rented a small apartment downtown. It wasn't much, a one-bedroom with outdated fixtures and a balcony that overlooked the alley. But it was mine. I spent the first weekend unpacking and arranging furniture, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction in creating a space that was entirely for me. I pulled my old guitar out of storage, the one I hadn't touched in years, and started playing again. At first, my fingers stumbled over the chords, stiff and clumsy from disuse. But as the days passed, the music began to flow, and with it, a sense of calm I hadn't felt in a long time. I started going to the gym regularly, not out of anger or a desire to prove anything, but because I needed to feel strong again. There was something therapeutic about pushing myself, about feeling my muscles ache and my lungs burn. It reminded me that I was still here, still capable of moving forward. Therapy was the hardest step to take, but also the most necessary. I'd resisted it at first, partly out of pride, partly because I didn't want to revisit the pain. But Eric, ever the voice of reason, convinced me to give it a shot. "You need to get this out of your system, man," he said one evening over beers. "Talking to someone who isn't me might actually help." So, I made an appointment. Sitting across from a stranger and unpacking the mess of my life wasn't easy. The first few sessions were mostly me fumbling through half-formed thoughts, but over time, I started to see the value in it. My therapist helped me unpack not just Clara's betrayal, but the patterns in our marriage that led us to that point. She didn't let me off the hook either. "What could you have done differently?" she asked more than once, forcing me to confront my own complacency, my tendency to retreat into routine instead of addressing the cracks when they first appeared. It was painful, but it was also freeing. For the first time, I began to see the past with clarity, not as something to dwell on, but as something to learn from. Meanwhile, Clara was struggling. I didn't hear much about her at first, but occasional updates filtered through mutual friends. Victor had moved on not long after the affair was exposed, leaving Clara to face the fallout on her own. Her once bright reputation at work had dimmed, and the whispers about her personal life followed her wherever she went. She reached out to me a few times, usually via text. The messages were short, filled with apologies and vague attempts to reconnect. "I hope you're doing okay. I'm so sorry for everything. I miss you." I read them but never responded. What was there to say? The time for explanations and apologies had passed. My decision to move on wasn't about punishing her. It was about protecting myself. Rebuilding wasn't easy, but it was worth it. I reconnected with old friends I hadn't seen in years, started saying yes to invitations instead of isolating myself. I even signed up for a photography class, something I'd always wanted to try but never made time for. One day, while walking through a local art gallery, I met someone. Her name was Sophie, and she had this quiet confidence that drew me in. We struck up a conversation about the exhibit, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a spark. It wasn't love at first sight, but it was something. A beginning. Looking back, I don't regret how things ended with Clara. Her betrayal was a breaking point, but it also forced me to take a hard look at myself and the life I wanted to build. Moving on didn't mean forgetting. It meant learning to carry the past without letting it define me. And as I stood on my balcony that evening, watching the city lights flicker against the night sky, I realized I was finally ready to let go. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like mine. It's funny how life has a way of surprising you, even after it's knocked you down. For months, I'd been wading through the wreckage of my marriage, carrying the weight of betrayal like a stone strapped to my chest. And yet, here I was, standing in a gallery filled with art, feeling something I hadn't felt in what seemed like forever. Hope. But before I get to that moment, let me back up. The journey here wasn't easy. Heartbreak leaves scars, ones you can't always see but feel in the quiet moments when the world slows down. I'd spent countless nights staring at the ceiling of my new apartment, wrestling with the echoes of Clara's betrayal. At first, the memories felt like a tidal wave, crashing over me without warning. But with time, and a lot of introspection, they began to feel more like ripples, present but manageable. Therapy helped. So did reconnecting with myself. The guitar, the gym, the photography class. All of it reminded me that I was more than just a husband or a victim of someone else's choices. I was James, a man who'd endured, who'd been broken, but who was still standing. The gallery event was something I almost skipped. My photography instructor had mentioned it in passing, saying it would be a good opportunity to see different perspectives and maybe even meet a few people. At first, the idea of mingling with strangers sounded exhausting, but something inside me pushed me to go. I arrived early, wandering through the space with a glass of wine in hand, letting the art draw me in. Each piece told a story, of loss, of joy, of resilience, and I found myself oddly comforted by the fact that even the most broken things could be turned into something beautiful. And then I saw her. She was standing in front of a painting, her head tilted slightly as she studied the brushstrokes. There was something about her. Maybe it was the way she seemed completely absorbed in the moment, or the faint smile that played at her lips. I hesitated, not wanting to disturb her, but then she turned and caught my eye. "Interesting, isn't it?" she said, gesturing to the painting. Her voice was warm, inviting. I nodded, stepping closer. "Yeah, it's raw, honest." She smiled. "That's what I love about it. It's not trying to be perfect. It just is." Her name was Sophia, and she was an artist. Not the kind who painted to sell, but the kind who painted because she couldn't imagine doing anything else. As we talked, I felt a sense of ease I hadn't experienced in months. There was no awkwardness, no pretense, just two people sharing a moment. Our conversation flowed effortlessly. We talked about art, life, and the little things that made us who we were. She had a way of listening that made me feel seen, really seen, in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. At one point she asked, "So, what brings you here? Are you an artist too?" I chuckled, shaking my head. "Not exactly. I'm trying my hand at photography, but I'm still figuring it out." She tilted her head, studying me for a moment. Figuring it out is part of the process. Sometimes the best things come from not knowing where you're going. Her words stayed with me long after the event ended. Meeting Sophia wasn't some grand, earth-shattering moment. It didn't erase the pain of the past or magically heal the scars left behind, but it was a start. As I drove home that night, I found myself smiling, a real, genuine smile that hadn't crossed my face in a long time. I wasn't thinking about Clara or Victor or the mess they'd left in my life. I was thinking about the possibility of something new, something better. For the first time in months, the future didn't feel like a shadowy, uncertain thing. It felt like an open canvas, waiting for me to decide what to paint. Looking back on everything, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the healing, I realized I wasn't the same person I had been. The old James might have seen himself as a victim, someone whose life had been derailed by another's selfishness. But the new James? He saw himself as a survivor, someone who had taken control of his story, rewritten it in his own words.